Welcome, everyone, to this latest edition of Atlantic Debrief. My name is Jörn Fleck. I'm the acting director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to be back for another issue of Atlantic Debrief, our social media interview format to provide analysis of the latest European and transatlantic political and policy developments. Today, we're discussing Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's annual State of the Union speech, which she held before the European Parliament on Wednesday morning. And here to discuss what came out of that speech is our distinguished fellow at the Europe Center, Frances Burwell. Fran, great to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Perhaps let me kick off with a general question, and you can give our viewers a flavor of what you thought were the top three key takeaways from this speech. Obviously, a huge focus on Ukraine, but I think there were also some other big themes weaved throughout this speech.
So I think these State of the Union speeches, whether it's in Washington or Brussels, they are intended in part to allow, in large part, to allow leading politicians to claim credit for things that they have done over the previous year and to set out their program, legislative or otherwise, for the coming year. And I think that von der Leyen did that, and she did it very well. This was a remarkable speech to me as someone who's watched the EU for a while, because in many respects it was a wartime speech. It was not very much of a laundry list of things, but really much more, not a laundry list of proposals, but much more a vision and claiming credit for the way the EU has evolved rather rapidly over the last few years. She has a very good passage where she talks about the amount of time it took the EU to respond to the financial crisis in 2012, and then how it took weeks to respond to the COVID crisis, the outbreak of COVID, but how when February 24th came around and Ukraine was invaded by Russia, the reaction in Europe was pretty much immediate and it was unified. And I think she's well justified in saying that. And as someone who has been traveling to Europe over the past year, off and on, for our American audience who may not have been doing that, I think there's a much more visceral feeling in Europe of the continent having a war on its doorstep. And I think that she very much brought that to the fore, including the fact that she had the First Lady of Ukraine there in the audience with her. So, and she is also, I guess right now, she's on her way to Kiev or already is there. But she was heading to Kiev as soon as the speech was over. I think she laid out the main challenges that are looking at, that are important to the European public and politicians and governments. So energy prices, the futures of the economies. I think, with COVID and now the war, we are seeing a lot of deficit spending by European governments. And even though the restrictions on that in the European Monetary Union have been lifted under the Stability and Growth Pact for a while, something's going to come back. So she addressed that. But she spent a lot of her time talking about democracy. And I thought that was really striking. She termed this as we're now in an age that is authoritarianism versus democracy. And she very much made the EU front and center part of that. The second thing I'd say about this speech is that it was very focused. It was focused on Ukraine. It was focused on the after effects or the things that we have learned about our economies because of Ukraine. So energy and the need to revisit the way energy has been run in the EU. Critical materials, because we've seen through both the pandemic and Ukraine, we've now seen issues with certain materials that we need for the next phase of our economy. She spoke a lot about democracy, as I mentioned, and about corruption as a corrosive force, It was a very interesting, I would say a very interesting slap at Viktor Orban and perhaps at the Poles as well, because she's very much underlined the importance of judicial independence and also the need to address corruption within the EU if the EU is going to be credible in addressing corruption outside of the EU. So that was another thing. But we didn't hear anything really about some of the key legislative priorities that the von der Leyen Commission has had. There was very little on the Green New Deal except as it related to energy and the fires that Europe has seen over the past year. It was presented the firefighting practices that the joint firefighting capabilities that Europe has amassed. She announced the purchase of more planes and more helicopters. So this was, again, Europe comes to the rescue in these climate emergencies. But we didn't hear about recycling, things like that are key to the Green Deal, nor did we hear about the digital.
I want to come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
What was missing, Fran, from this speech?
Okay, sorry.
Made you listen up. That's okay. But before we go there, you already mentioned it wasn't sort of a laundry list that these speeches sometimes can be, but there were still a number of proposals, and you already mentioned on the energy side, electricity price caps. I think there's some concrete proposals there related, as I said, to energy, the critical minerals initiatives. What were sort of two or three of those that you think, especially American observers, should pay attention to?
Well, I do think the energy package is quite striking. Now, it was addressed further after the speech by Executive Vice President Timmermans, who's running the Green Deal. So he gave some more specifics, because these speeches almost never have, real proposal specifics in them. And he was the one who talked about reducing consumption by 5%, mandatory, during high peak hours, and that this eventually would become 10%. But I think also one of the biggest things that we're seeing is the decoupling of the price that one charges for gas versus the price one charges for electricity generated by much cheaper means, given gas is extremely high price right now. And what has happened is that Europe has been charging everybody on the gas price. But now that will not happen. There will be limits on the price for others who are using wind power or solar or nuclear. And this will bring this will lower gas prices, at least that's the theory. So this is a very effective way of looking at how to get out of not the energy supply crisis, but the energy price crisis in Europe. These are proposals. They're not done. So we'll have to see how they fare. We have some upcoming meetings of the Council. But I think it also will stimulate some thought about energy markets here and elsewhere as we move towards a greener energy economy, and there's more distinction between how you get energy, different types of energy. The other thing is, I think the critical minerals initiative, we don't really know what that is going to mean. She just mentioned it, but she clearly intends that it would build on the Battery Alliance and their CHIPS Act, the EU CHIPS Act. So it will undoubtedly come out as a little bit of industrial policy to address the need to have these minerals. And that will involve subsidies. It will involve, reshoring production and things like that. And that is something that the US and the EU need to work on together so that we don't end up in competition with each other to the benefit of others.
I think overall, linked to that, to what you just mentioned, is sort of what did you make of these various initiatives that all seem to amount to a shift away from Europe as this staunchly open markets, free trade actor in the global economy, that the European Union as a trade actor with its internal market has been. That is one thing that struck me about all of these different things she mentioned, also on other dependencies, on China, on the investment efforts that she outlined in third countries. But what do you make of this? Is that a real significant shift? Does that merely continue a trend we've seen recently emerge?
I think it is part of a trend, but it's like there's been a step jump in the trend, right? And that comes from Ukraine. And it is very much more of a movement towards a managed economy. There was a phrase in there about thinking about who our energy partners are, as though they would then determine, okay, we can get energy from Norway and the US and others that we think are friendly, but it's not an open market where you don't take politics into account about this. So I think we don't know how far they're going to go down that path, but the path is clearly there.
Yeah. Coming back to, you already sort of talked about what was missing, and people always sort of try to read the tea leaves there a little bit. I think the United States and transatlantic was really only mentioned once, maybe. What were some? You've done a lot of work on the US-EU digital policy agenda. That seemed to be largely missing. That was such a big piece of prior efforts and prior speeches by the president. So anything that struck you there on what was missing?
Well, I think that this is, when I say it's like a wartime speech, it's not a foreign policy speech. So she didn't mention NATO, I don't think. The U.S. was mostly mentioned in terms of supplying LNG. And really didn't talk about partnerships with anyone. This was about the domestic state of the European Union. So I don't know if we, sitting in Washington, should look at that any differently. We tend in the United States, the President's State of the Union always has a foreign policy component, but she did not really, other than to say we're going to stand steadfast by Ukraine. She also mentioned the Balkans, Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova as future members, and talked about accession and needing to get serious. And she talked about migration a little bit. But in terms of legislative programs, she didn't talk about digital at all. Even in the democracy part of the speech, she didn't talk about disinformation and the efforts that the EU has made to counter Russian and other disinformation within its own society. She didn't talk about agriculture. She didn't talk about European defense. So there are a lot of things that were not talked about. I think a decision must have been made to keep this speech very, very focused on Ukraine and on the energy issues. I think that was probably a good choice given the priorities of the European public right now. One thing that was interesting to me was that in the phrasing of the migration part, she spoke about we need to have control of our borders, but we need to look at how we greeted the Ukrainians as an example for how we should greet others and not as the exception. And to me, this is a pushback against parties like the Sweden Democrats, who did very well in the election and have had a very anti-immigrant posture, as well as some of the parties that are likely to be in the next coalition in Italy. Not to mention, again, Viktor Orban. So I think that she did push back on some of those. The one thing that surprised me was that at the very end, she brought up the European Convention and called for a European Convention. This is the beginning of treaty revision. And for those of us who follow the EU, we know that treaty revision is a long, boring, and difficult challenge. Doesn't always work out. It's a very risky move. A lot of people don't care about it. So I'm not sure it's like a vote getter, as we would call it. But she did call for it. And there are plenty of people who think it is time to get rid of unanimity, the remaining areas of unanimity in EU policymaking. I don't know if that's what she has in mind, but clearly she wants to move forward in that direction. that would launch something that would go probably far beyond her tenure, certainly her current tenure. So I think that to me is the one question mark about this speech. It kind of got dropped in at the end. There it was. But otherwise, I think this was a really excellent speech that really demonstrated the times in which Europe is living right now.
Great. Last question. You already mentioned the European Convention. There was speak of the European political community, of loosening debt rules to accommodate debt and deficits that had built up over the pandemic and now the war and the energy and economic crisis. On balance, without going into detail, you can't cover 27 member state reactions, but do you think member states will be on balance happy with the speech, or are there challenging points in here?
On balance, I think they'll be happy. Nobody will like every part of the speech. One of the things that was very interesting was an early admission by someone who is a German CDU politician that they should have listened to the Central Europeans more about Russia. And I thought that was very bold of her, given her domestic. I mean, that's not necessarily where the CDU is coming from, though certainly the CDU that she grew up in. She was a protege of Angela Merkel's. So that's one thing that might cause some people to have a little, not heartburn, that's a bit strong, but I think overall, most of the things will be things that the member states will be okay with, because the situation, the context in Europe right now is pushing everyone together. Everyone realizes something needs to happen on energy. No one will be happy with every single energy provision that she put forward. Her hope is that in order to get anything passed, she can put together a coalition of things that will make everyone want to take parts of it, even if they don't like all of it. So I think she did that pretty well. But we'll have to see. Most of these things that she talked about are only proposals. They're not going to happen unless she gets the agreement of the member states, and in some cases, the agreement of Parliament. So the next 6 months will show a lot. In fact, even the next month or two will show a lot as to the receptivity of the member states and the Parliament to the measures outlined in this speech.
Thank you so much, Fran. And that's the cue to keep following us as we watch and analyze the next month, the next half year, and beyond that on von der Leyen's and the EU's efforts to address the current challenges and put this general plan into action. And so thank you again, Fran, for giving us your reactions to President von der Leyen's State of the Union speech. We will continue to watch that space, and we look forward to having all of you join us again soon for another Atlantic Debrief. Thank you so much.